Love it. Thank you so much. And thank you for such an amazing introduction and for having me here. I really appreciate it. Definitely not a rock star, but I appreciate the introduction.
Well, you missed our conversation. Yeah, you missed our conversation yesterday about a fibromyalgia concert. So I think you right now yes, you are the rock star. We have to support you, and we appreciate all the support for the Support Fibromyalgia Network and everything you do for the entire fibromyalgia community.
Thank you so much. It's part of my life mission, so I really appreciate it. And I've been on a little hiatus, but I'm back and I'm excited to jump in and talk about some fibromyalgia research stuff, which I promise won't be boring. This is like exciting, interesting research with little pictures of mice. It's great.
Well, Dr. Marco Loggia was on the stage yesterday, so I was nerding out with neuroinflammation.
Yay. Oh, wow. Yes, very interesting. I'm looking forward to seeing all those talks from yesterday when they are available. I was unfortunately working, but I'm happy they're being recorded so I can see them.
Yes, everything, just reminding our fibromyalgia friends, everything is getting recorded. And I think this day will be a little easier since we're pausing between and stopping the broadcast. So what we'll do is if you go to the replay area, the presentation from yesterday afternoon is available to watch. It's hours long. So what we're going to do at some point is edit it out by presentation, and then we'll have it eventually uploaded out there to the social media world. But anyone that's here now can start watching those replays as soon as they get published. So I'll be sure to work after this to get this published as well. But I'm going to let Dr. Lipton start her presentation, and Brandy and I will see you later. We'll be backstage and we will get started.
Thank you. All right. Oh, there I am, and there with my slides too. Well, hello everybody. I'm excited to be able to talk today about fibromyalgia research, and it's a really important component because, studies and evidence-based medicine, that's actually what kind of advances the needle, so to speak, on fibromyalgia care. I can publish all the case reports I want. I can publish a book that talks about, treating fibromyalgia, and we can, post videos and have conferences, and we can do everything of that nature. But unless it's actually been published in a peer-reviewed journal, your doctors, your conventional medicine doctors, aren't going to pay any mind to it. Even then, sometimes they don't. But that's actually, I think, such an important component. And we're really lacking in funding for research for fibromyalgia right now. I mean, for obvious reasons, most research funding right now is going towards COVID and viral illnesses, and that's totally appropriate. But we've actually been really struggling for funding and, legitimacy in the medical field for a long time. So as I'm pivoting, I don't know if most of you know, so I founded the Frida Center for Fibromyalgia as a clinic to treat fibromyalgia specifically. First founded in 2010, then took a hiatus, founded again in 2015. Dr. Silva, who you just saw, joined me there for a while, and we learned a lot from each other, and I adore her. Hi, Dr. Silva. But this year, I actually closed the Frida Center as far as the patient care aspect, and I'm really trying to pivot more towards doing research, publishing it, finding ways to fund it, because again, I think that's the way that I can advance the needle. And maybe it's because I'm middle-aged and I'm starting to think about, like, what do I want to leave, this earth with, what I want to have done and accomplished in my life. And I want to really improve care for fibromyalgia patients. And the fact is, we have to have studies and research and science behind that. So that's what I'm pivoting towards. So I thought this would be an appropriate way to kind of start. And what I'm going to do is actually start with the most interesting and the most recent kind of fibromyalgia study that I think would have gotten more attention if it wasn't published during the COVID pandemic, but did get some attention, and it was the fibromyalgia mouse study. So let's talk about that. Okay, there we go. Oh, it's kind of small. I hope you guys can see it okay. what this is, so this study was published in the summer of 2021. And it really kind of revolutionized how we think about fibromyalgia, because this study showed that there's an immune system component to what's going on in fibromyalgia. So this is actually a visual representation of what they did in this study. And they're starting to incorporate that into studies when they publish them, which I think is so great, because not everybody, learns in the same way. And I think kind of this visual aspect is so perfect, and also really helps it be more understandable for the layperson or somebody that doesn't have the medical experience. So what they did is they took blood from fibromyalgia patients and healthy folks. They purified and they took out just the IgG antibodies. Before the pandemic, probably nobody would know what that meant, but now everybody is like, yes, the IgG, everybody's sort of a junior virologist. We understand a lot more about antibodies now. Basically, these are the antibodies that stick around in your system. So they took antibodies from fibromyalgia patients, they took antibodies from healthy patients, and they gave them to mice. And the mice that received the antibodies from the fibromyalgia patients developed fibromyalgia symptoms. And this is where it starts to get really interesting, because it's like, well, so does this mean that this is an autoimmune disease? And I'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end. But what you can see here is that the poor little mice that were given the antibodies, the fibromyalgia antibodies, they developed pain-like behavior. So they were more sensitive to a little filament when it touched their hand. Their nerves actually were hyperexcitable, so that when they got a little stimulus, there was like more pain signaling coming. They had reduced activity, so they weren't walking around as much. Maybe that's because their paws hurt. Maybe it's because they were feeling tired. We don't know. They weren't able to tell us. We also saw some nerve damage in the paws of the mice that received antibodies from fibromyalgia patients. And then we saw binding of these antibodies to a particular part of the spinal cord, which is really important in how pain signals get interpreted by the brain. And so that's the part where it's like, maybe this could kind of tie together what we understand already about fibromyalgia. And could this sort of be, and I think it maybe is, kind of the missing link to understanding what's going on in our muscles, in our nerves? Why do they hurt so much? Why are we so hypersensitive? And then also, why is our brain hypersensitive to pain? So what this study really shows me is that there is an immune component to fibromyalgia pain. Now, interestingly, this wasn't permanent. So when they gave these antibodies to the mice, after a few weeks, once their immune system had sort of cleared out these foreign antibodies, all the mice got back to normal. So we don't have to worry about these poor fibromyalgia mice wandering around. They all returned to normal once the antibodies were gone from their system. So I got a lot of questions when this study came out. Things like, does that mean fibromyalgia is an autoimmune disease? Does that mean it's, we're going to have new treatments? And I think, the first question is, it might possibly mean that fibromyalgia is more in the realm of autoimmune disease. I think there's some question about that, and I'll talk a little bit more about why that is later. And of course, we need more research, obviously, but it certainly could help us develop new treatments. And the way that fibromyalgia research and most research gets funded is if pharmaceutical companies can see a target, meaning something that they can intervene with a medication, they will pour billions and billions of dollars into researching it. And so that's a good thing. And so I do think that this means we're going to see a lot more money coming in to fibromyalgia studies. Yay, we really need that. In fact, about 3 months after this study was published, I got contacted by a pharmaceutical company that wanted my input on, what I felt about this medication that they were developing for fibromyalgia. And I was like, wow, that was quick. So good news, money gonna come. It's that will really advance the science, and hopefully we can get more publications and hopefully even some treatments from it. But of course, this isn't the full story, and there's actually a lot of other things going on in fibromyalgia that can't be explained just by antibodies. And so that's the piece that I want to take a step back and help you understand a bit more, sort of the basics, like what we already have known about fibromyalgia for the past 20 years or so. And that's important because then you can kind of add in the antibody data in a really meaningful way. And I think by the end of this lecture, at least my goal is that you will understand more about the science of fibromyalgia than most doctors. And well, that's really sad in a way because, you know, your healthcare providers should understand fibromyalgia. The reality is, and I know, you know, as I'm sure you guys have talked about a lot as kind of the advocacy component of this, we often have to educate our own doctors. And that's part of why I wrote the Fibro Manual, was to help patients be able to educate their own doctors, to kind of help their doctors help them. And there's also at the back of it, there's like an 8-page kind of part that's just for doctors that you can photocopy and give to them. And it's all based on research and the evidence-based information that doctors are looking for. And when I say doctors, I apologize. I do mean healthcare providers of all flavors, not trying to exclude anyone. So what do we already know about fibromyalgia? Well, anybody that has heard me speak before or has read my book knows that I feel like what kind of triggers or starts the chain reaction of fibromyalgia is a trauma, an illness, an injury, an infection, something that activates our sympathetic nervous system, and that's our fight or flight nervous system. And then there's this abnormal response where that reaction does not stop. So there's this hyperactivity, this kind of relentless activity of the fight or flight nervous system. And there's a lot of data to support that, and you know, in a lot of different ways, we've learned that in fibromyalgia patients, our fight or flight nervous system has gone totally haywire. And it's like a smoke alarm that just goes off all the time. There's no fire, there's no smoke, but boy, those danger signals are coming. And the brain is constantly sending messages down to our body that we are in danger. And so what do you do when your fight or flight nervous system is activated? Well, your body gets prepared to flee or fight. And for both of those responses, you need to have tight muscles, right? Because you're like trying to like get all your power so you can fight off the danger. And what do we see in fibromyalgia? Exactly that. We see high pressure in our muscles. We see muscles that have a hard time relaxing, really tight and tense. And anybody with fibromyalgia, literally 100% of people I've talked to that have fibromyalgia experience that like all the time. If you like right now, if you just sit and like take an inventory of your body, like, do you feel like your muscles are tight or tense? Yeah. I mean, even I do right now. And, you know, I did deep breathing exercises before this, but my muscles are like ready to fight. And so I have to really kind of work with my body to try to quiet that down, try to relax my muscles. And the one thing I'll just say really quickly is a study that came out just last year, maybe 2020, was really interesting. They found that the pressure inside fibromyalgia muscles is high enough that it almost reaches the point of kind of a surgical emergency called compartment syndrome, where the pressure is so high that it actually can damage muscles. So it's not quite that high in fibromyalgia, but it's almost there. And so what do you think our muscles do? Well, they're really angry and inflamed, and they're working really hard to maintain this tension. So there's markers of oxidative stress, and basically you see a lot of energy being used and used up. And then you have these kind of byproducts of energy use that are a little bit inflammatory and irritating to the muscles. So you've got tight muscles, they're really tense, they're inflamed, And it's not just the muscles, it's also the fascia, the connective tissue that surrounds them. The other thing that we see with fight or flight nervous system activation is poor sleep. So imagine literally trying to sleep with a smoke alarm on. Like, maybe you'd fall asleep. I doubt it. But if you did, you're going to get really light sleep because your brain's going to keep waking up and being like, why is the smoke alarm on? Maybe we should evacuate. So that's, kind of metaphorically what's happening with sleep in fibromyalgia. So we get very kind of light, superficial, non-restorative sleep. In sleep studies, they've done a lot of different sleep studies. You can kind of see, rather than the nice deep sleep, which is sort of the relaxing sleep and the part of sleep that's really restorative to our body, what we see is light sleep that actually has some awake brain waves. They call it alpha delta sleep. So basically, it's like awake on top of deep sleep. And one of my patients, this is like the best analogy ever. She said, it's like sleeping with one eye open. Another analogy is like airplane sleep. So for people that don't have fibromyalgia, like if you're trying to explain it to your spouse or family member who doesn't have fibromyalgia, be like, okay, remember the last time that you were on an airplane and you slept? Was it like good sleep? No, you were like sort of still awake and you felt kind of terrible when you woke up and then you're maybe jet lagged. I think that's a pretty good analogy for what fibromyalgia sleep can feel like. And that's why, at least in my clinical practice, I focus so hard on trying to improve sleep quality. And that's something I focus a lot on in the Fibro Manual. And I believe that might be the page 78 that Melissa referred to, although I'm not sure, but I think that is probably the table she might be referring to. So we've got smoke alarm, danger signals, tense muscles, poor sleep, and then we've got inflammation, and inflammation floating around in our blood, in the fluid around our brain, around our spinal cord. And then we have immune cells that are angry and activated in the brain. And it sounds like kind of that neuroinflammation piece I was reviewed in a lecture yesterday, which is fantastic because you really have to understand that. And I've heard fibromyalgia be described as a brain on fire. And, if you look at this image here, this is from a study where they were looking at these glial or immune cells of the brain, which normally should not be activated in a healthy brain. You can see that they are activated everywhere in fibromyalgia brains. And to me, this actually does look like a brain on fire, like just the image. And so you see that there's all this neuroinflammation, and we've seen that in a lot of ways, but these imaging studies help looking at the chemicals that are in the cerebrospinal fluid that bathes the brain and the spinal cord. We see increased inflammatory chemicals, increased substance P. P stands for pain. This is kind of a messenger molecule that sends pain signals or kind of amplifies pain signals. And then in our bloodstream, you see elevated inflammatory cytokines. And there's been a lot of different studies looking at different cytokines and what do they mean in fibromyalgia. And if you guys remember, there's that test called FMA. One of the things that they look for in that test, they try to use it as a diagnostic tool for fibromyalgia, is kind of the pattern of inflammatory chemicals in our blood. So we have inflamed brain, inflamed blood, glial cells that are activated. And why does that matter? Like what does glial cell activation mean? Well, glial cells are actually really significant in developing that central sensitization, or, a lot of people have heard that term at this point about kind of explaining, it's one way that we've been explaining fibromyalgia pain for about 20 years. But another way to think about it is just sort of the brain is amplifying pain signals. That's what central sensitization means. Central nervous system, overly sensitive to input that's coming in. And we're learning that the glia, also called microglia, are really important in this process. And that once something activates them, I mean, they're kind of like the little security guards driving around the brain, like do, not paying attention. Once they see danger, they generate a huge amount of inflammatory and excitatory chemicals, and the brain becomes this just inflammatory soup, and it really irritates all the neurons, and the ones that are important in pain regulation are really the most irritated. And so you see this really impressive pain signal amplification, or just volume. The volume of pain is turned up. And so this concept of central sensitization is how we've been describing fibromyalgia for about 20 years. So it is happening in fibromyalgia, but I think a lot of healthcare providers and scientists sort of got this far, and this was in about 2002, 2003, that we kind of determined that this was causing or contributing to fibromyalgia pain. A lot of people just kind of stopped there. Like, okay, central sensitization, that's what's happening. All sorts of money was poured into researching this, and I'll go into it a little bit more in the next slide. But this is actually how we kind of got some legitimacy, actually, as far as for fibromyalgia as a diagnosis. So because of this, I think it's important to go into this study. Although it says 2016 down here, that's a review article. This study came out in 2002. So prior to 2002, there was actually no objective, meaning documentable, repeatable data that could show that fibromyalgia patients were experiencing the pain, the fatigue, and the fog that they were describing. So this is where the response came. It's not real, all in their head, hysterical women, all that stuff. And that was actually, so I developed fibromyalgia in 2000, and that was the response I got. And so I'm in medical school, and everybody's like, well, it's not a real illness. And I was like, well, feels pretty real to me. And then my third year of medical school, this study came out. And actually, I had an attending, one of my teachers, come to me and apologize because he had sort of blown me off about having fibromyalgia, because this study was documentable. So again, this is really important to understand why we need to have documentable, objective data that is published and out there. So briefly, what they did in this study is they took healthy people with fibromyalgia, put them in MRI machines that measured blood flow. So they're called functional MRI machines. And what they did is they looked at both blood flow in the brain in response to pain. So they took these very brave volunteers, put them in these MRI machines. And if you've ever been in an MRI machine, they're very kind of scary on themselves. But then they put their thumbs, everybody's thumbs, in these vices. So basically, they were clamping down on their thumb, and they said, hey, tell us when you first start to feel pain. And so what happened was the patients with fibromyalgia, and that's the little red triangle here, said ouch at a much earlier time point. Much less stimulus was required for them to say ouch. It took almost double the amount of that for people without fibromyalgia to say ouch. So that in and of itself, okay, yes, we can see patients are more sensitive to pain. But what actually kind of proved it was that the areas of the brain that lit up in both fibromyalgia patients and healthy controls were the same. So pain sensing areas were lit up. It just took a lot less pressure for fibromyalgia patients to light up. However, in addition, and this is these little red areas, there were some extra parts of the brain that were recruited in fibromyalgia, some abnormal recruitment of brain cells. And that's where people actually started to say, like, maybe something's not working right in the brain in fibromyalgia. And maybe that's what's happening. And maybe it's just that the brain is more sensitive to pain. And again, I said this was in 2002. Suddenly there was a research target. Pharmaceutical companies spent bazillions of dollars researching fibromyalgia, central sensitization. And out of that decade, we were left with, that's where they developed duloxetine, Cymbalta, and pregabalin, Lyrica as ways to treat central sensitization. So that decade was pretty amazing as far as fibromyalgia research, funding, et cetera. Now, after 2012, right when I was heading into like, let's get some research going, all the funding dropped off because they sort of were like, we figured it out. All right, we've got some drugs to treat it. And, it's really still in their head. It's just like actually in their brain, but, we'll call it central sensitization. We're good. And for a long time, there really wasn't a lot of research beyond that. And that is part of what I am sort of I have been since 2012, trying to sort of change, because I think that there is so much else going on in the brain and body with fibromyalgia that is not explained just by central sensitization or just by the immune system component with the mouse study. And so I will kind of tie this all together at the end, don't worry, because, all of this is important, but the question is, how does it tie together? And does it tie together in like a unifying hypothesis that could actually explain what is happening in the body and fibromyalgia and how do we treat it? And what's important and what we need to do is get as much data and studies done as we can so that we can kind of prove to the medical community what's actually happening in fibromyalgia. And that's how we'll get really effective treatments. Because as I've argued since 2012, if central sensitization explained everything about fibromyalgia, then duloxetine and pregabalin would be a cure, right? Be like, okay, great, got this medicine, took it, feel better. At best, most people get about 30% improvement in symptoms with those medications. So clearly, it's not the whole picture, right? But we can't just stop there. So, okay, now we're back to some mice. So now we've kind of looked at what we know is happening in fibromyalgia. We know that there's a sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight nervous system gone haywire. We know that there's poor sleep. We know that there's tight, inflamed muscles. There's inflammation in the blood. There's inflammation in the spinal fluid, in the brain fluid, in the brain, in those glial cells. We know there's central sensitization. So with that, and this is actually what I have been thinking about a lot since this mice study came out. And in fact, I have a paper that I submitted, it's under peer review right now, that sort of explains kind of my hypothesis as to how this antibody study plays into all the other things we know about fibromyalgia. And it actually fits, I think it's like that last missing puzzle piece. So I think it's pretty exciting. I just, it's kind of hard to get the message out there. And I could be wrong. I totally could be wrong. I'm not saying that I have all the answers. I just feel like it's like a logical and rational way that we can pull it all together. So imagine that you have muscles that are constantly tense. They are going to experience micro trauma, little tiny injuries with each movement. So we're going to have kind of constantly some micro injuries happening in the muscle, in the fascia. And what happens in the body, actually, interestingly, is one way that the body responds to injury, particularly soft tissue injury, is with antibodies. So could these antibodies that are floating around in our blood and that when we give it to mice causes them to experience similar symptoms to us, could these antibodies actually be generated from this kind of constant inflammatory response that's happening in our muscles and in our fascia? So that's my theory. I've always been interested in myofascial contribution to fibromyalgia, and as many of you know, myofascial release is something I sing the praises of because it for me was really what reduced my pain significantly. That's when I kind of knew in medical school, like there's something going on in the muscles. So I'm a little biased because of my personal experience, but my theory is that these antibodies that are floating around in our bloodstream are actually antibodies against muscle, collagen, fascial components, extracellular matrix components, and they're abnormal. They shouldn't be there because normally we don't have a muscle injury unless we have a muscle injury, right? But we have this sort of constant all over muscle injury, almost like a muscle bruise all over. And if it can feel like that, so it makes sense to me. That is not the conclusion that the researchers doing the mouse study made. So my theory is that whole chain reaction that I just talked about kind of is generating these abnormal extra antibodies that, when given to healthy mice, actually start attacking their healthy muscles and fascia, right? And start generating an inflammatory response in them, and also activating at the dorsal root ganglion. And this, I'm going to talk a bit more. I know I have about 8 minutes left, but this is really important to understand. The dorsal root ganglion is sort of the waylay station between our peripheral nerves, the nerves, that are sensory nerves, our spinal cord, and our brain. It also has receptors for antibodies. So when it senses an abnormal antibody response, it gets triggered, and it can send signals up to the brain saying, hey, there's something going on. There's something going on. We sense an injury. And there's lots of clinical models, mostly done in mice and rats, where they can generate hypersensitivity, central sensitization, basically. They can generate the same response in that we did with our fibromyalgia antibodies with other antibodies. So it's not just that fibromyalgia antibodies bind at the dorsal root ganglion. If you take a mouse and cut their paw, they will get antibodies directed against the skin, the whatever tissue was cut through, that will bind at the dorsal root ganglion and cause pain hypersensitivity. So I don't feel like this is a unique response to fibromyalgia, but that is the conclusion that the people doing this study made. What they said and what they theorized is that fibromyalgia is an autoimmune disease where there is antibodies directed against the dorsal root ganglion. So just like in rheumatoid arthritis, there's abnormal antibodies. I can't figure out the left and right. Okay. In rheumatoid arthritis, there's abnormal antibodies that are kind of generated against connective tissue, particularly in our joints, and that's what causes the pain. What the authors were saying of this study, and I personally think their conclusion is wrong, but what they concluded is that fibromyalgia there must be antibodies against this particular part of the nervous system. And it would be great if it was as simple as that, but then how do you explain the fight or flight nervous system abnormalities, the sleep abnormalities, the inflammation in the blood, the tight muscles, the inflammation in the fascia, all of those other things that we know are happening in fibromyalgia. So I think it's a really interesting first start, but their conclusion was wrong. And that's what I proposed in my study, which I hope, or my hypothesis article, I guess, that I hope gets published. So what they said is that they think antibodies interacting with the dorsal root ganglia and fibromyalgia generate the pain hypersensitivity. And, there is a role, but I think they interpreted it incorrectly. And I know this is a little confusing, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about dorsal root ganglia, and I think it will help explain this a bit more. So dorsal root ganglia are these little peanut-sized bundles of kind of the cell bodies, or the brain, so to speak, of our sensory nerves. And so I like to imagine these as like little octopus that have two arms. So they have a brain, and it's like bundled together in the dorsal root ganglia. And then one arm goes to the spinal cord, and one arm goes to the sensory nerves. So one arm might go to, right here, sensing my palm. So if you think about these peanut-sized little bundles of a brain, right? These brains are actually really interested in what's happening in the immune system, because antibodies and inflammation can affect these brains in lots of different ways, these little brains of the sensory nerves. They also are covered in glial cells, which sounds familiar, right? These are different glial cells, but the same kind of idea. They're immune cells that surround these neurons. And so you have these little peanut-sized bundles that have immune cells, that have the brains, the cell bodies of these sensory nerves, and they have a lot of blood flow. So they're getting a lot of information, what's happening in the blood, and they're getting information from inflammatory chemicals like cytokines and from antibodies. And so I think that this is where they kind of play that role in interpreting for the brain what's happening in the periphery. Because the brain doesn't know, oh, we have a huge cut right here, right? Like the brain doesn't necessarily know that. It has to get that information from the sensory nerve, which sends it up to the brain and the dorsal root ganglion, which then interprets it and sends it up to the brain. And the interpretation that it gives is what can either make things hypersensitive, normal sensitivity. It's almost like the brain of these cell bodies is saying like, danger, no danger, danger, no danger. And in fibromyalgia, I think they're getting all sorts of danger signals because of the antibodies that are being generated against muscle, fascia, all of our kind of connective tissue, maybe even our peripheral nerves. And so they're saying like, whoa, something's really going on. We better amplify this signal up to the brain. And then once the brain gets it, the brain is like, oh my God, something's really going on. We better amplify and activate all these glial cells. And then you have kind of a hot mess, right? Like you have this hot, inflammatory, angry brain, angry spinal cord. And it could be that these antibodies are kind of the connection. And they're a really important filter for pain signals. So we've known this for a long time, but we haven't until recently understood the antibody component. And that's what's exciting about the mouse study. So as I said earlier, I think visuals are also really good. So in case your brain was like, what, peanut sized? What are you talking about? Here is a picture. So here's our spinal cord. Here is a picture of a dorsal root ganglion, and they come out at each spinal cord level through our, this is a spinal nerve coming out. And then here is the brain and kind of the cell body of these nerves surrounded by immune cells. And then here's a little short arm, one arm of the octopus that connects with the spinal cord there. And then here is the other arm that's going out and is sensing pain or information from muscles, skin, soft tissue. And as you can see here, I kind of wrote, I think that this is what's generating the amplification. Oh my gosh, I think I hit just at 40 minutes. Wow, that is kind of amazing. So with that, I just want to say I really appreciate all of you as far as the advocacy work that you do. And I think advocacy work can be as simple as just standing up for yourself with your doctor, talking about the new research. Maybe your doctor hasn't heard about the fibromyalgia mouse study, but I'll give you on the next page the reference list. You can look it up, print it out, give it to them. Maybe they'll have a better understanding. It's, I think a lot of folks are actually more able to interpret and read research studies, particularly the abstracts, even without any medical training. But now, because of COVID, so many people really understand a lot more about the immune system and antibodies. I think most of you would totally be able to really understand it. And I think you're probably a lot smarter than you give yourself credit for. Just try to pick a non-foggy moment and look at the study. It is really interesting. Although, as I said, I think they got the wrong conclusion. So these references are tiny. I apologize. Hopefully you'll be able to see them. If not, if you just Google fibromyalgia mouse study, it will come up. I guarantee it. And it was a pretty big deal for a little bit there. And I really appreciate your time and attention. And I look forward to answering probably really hard science questions you're going to give me. So, you know, I'll do my best.
Hello, we're back. Oh, we appreciate it. Are you ready for some live Q&A? Let's first take out the presentation and then we'll share more. We always like to start with the cheering because that always works more, and everybody is saying excellent, thank you, amazing job.
I told you the comments were going to blow up with you, Dr. Lipton, and it did.
I'm so glad that people are talking about it at the lupus conference. That's great. Oh, thank you.
Well, we figured out that there's a lot of overlap in our community. So
yes, and I think it's really brilliant that you guys are joining forces. And you know, if it is really, if there is an autoimmune component to fibromyalgia, it makes so much sense to join forces. And you know, there's power in numbers, right? So I think it's beautiful that you guys are doing this together.
Well, that is one of the questions that keeps coming up for confirmation, because there's a lot of confusion about autoimmune condition, with central nervous system. Like, what exactly is going on for this definition? Is the research there? Like, what do we know about being an autoimmune condition?
So if you use the interpretation that the authors did, which is that there are antibodies directed against your own tissue that are causing pathology, that are causing problems, then it would meet the definition of an autoimmune condition. So that's basically what an autoimmune, the definition broadly is. It doesn't have to be antibodies, but an immune response that is abnormally activated against self. And so if it's activated against yourself, and it shouldn't be, then it's an autoimmune condition. Even things like Hashimoto's thyroiditis, that is an autoimmune condition because there are abnormal antibodies directed against the thyroid tissue itself that cause damage. And so there is a potential, and I think what's confusing is it does, in fibromyalgia, can we explain everything by an immune response against ourself? Like, is there an immune response against the glial cells and that's what's triggering things? Or is there an immune response against our muscles and that's what's triggering things? There's been a lot of work looking at autoimmune. Like, originally, why fibromyalgia was grouped into rheumatology, which is kind of the field that studies autoimmune conditions, is because people thought, oh, it must be an autoimmune condition directed against the muscles because people's muscles hurt. But they weren't ever able to find any antibodies directed against the muscles, or at least the ones that they were looking for. So over time, people moved away from fibromyalgia being an autoimmune condition because they couldn't find actually any evidence of kind of damage caused by our immune system. Now, this mouse study does start to show like, oh, whoa, there is some damage because it's causing this pain hypersensitivity. So could that kind of make it an autoimmune condition, like make it fit the diagnosis? I think so, but I think there needs to be more research done. And I think it's like really, really early days. And again, as I said, I feel like the conclusion of that study was maybe not correct. So, but they did in the study, they kind of said, so this means fibromyalgia could be an autoimmune disease. And certainly there are some autoimmune disease treatments that we could try for fibromyalgia. And if those work, then I think that's like more data, like, oh yeah. But a lot of the treatments that we've tried 20, 30, 40 years, they've been trying kind of autoimmune treatments for fibromyalgia with little success. Like prednisone, for example, doesn't usually do much for fibromyalgia, but for a lupus or rheumatoid flare, it usually will calm things way down. So that's the part. Certainly fibromyalgia is not fitting into a classic autoimmune picture. That's how I would say.
Yeah, well, we definitely need more research because we know that autoimmune conditions tend to flock together, or can have that spectrum of multiple autoimmune conditions. And so I'll never forget Dr. Jared Younger on the stage, the same stage you were speaking on at the LDN conference. He said someone needs to research why there's so much prevalence of fibromyalgia in the lupus community. So I took that words of wisdom, and that's why we're working with our good friends Looms for Lupus.
Excellent.
I'm not a researcher, but I remember that distinctly with him being on stage. He says that he showed the prevalence. It's huge prevalence in family systems. And I know Estella has that prevalence in her family. So I'm like, okay, let's work together and collaborate and our friends in the autoimmune space.
Absolutely. And a lot of people with fibromyalgia, I think somewhere in the 30 to 40% range, have a comorbid or coexisting autoimmune condition, whether it's lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, inflammatory bowel disease, thyroid, hypothyroidism. So many people have hypothyroidism. So yeah, I mean, it would totally make sense. And I think it's going to be really interesting. I'm hoping that bazillions of dollars will be, dedicated over the next 10 years to exploring that component of fibromyalgia. And maybe we'll get some better answers and better treatments. And then maybe it could even help lupus or rheumatoid arthritis. Could there be some benefit both ways? That would be wonderful.
Well, and I know Francis had a question, so I'll get to that. I just found it. And then I have another question in the similar realm of what I posed to Dr. Logia, who actually spoke yesterday. The research that I was referring to was the brain glial activation in fibromyalgia. So that 2019 study, which we need more of. But here's Francis's question. So I understand that there's a lot of talk about inflammation when we talk a major factor, but is there any sort of positive inflammatory values in the blood work at all?
So, perfect question. The standard things that we test for inflammation, which are SED rate, ESR, CRP, like if you just go to your doctor and they check you for inflammation, those tend to be elevated in classic inflammatory autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, lupus. They are not elevated in fibromyalgia. If you, however, check other things, like if you look at levels of IL-6, that cytokine that I mentioned, that is part of the inflammatory response of the immune system, the cytokine studies in fibromyalgia all have pretty much shown that there is inflammation. It's just that those are only tested in research. It's not something that you typically test or even can get tested for outside of the research setting. So that's one thing that drives me kind of crazy, is because so many doctors will say that to me, because I'll present about, LDN and inflammation, and they'll be like, but inflammatory markers are normal. And I'm like, okay, there's like 400 inflammatory markers, and there's 2 that are normal in fibromyalgia. But like, do you think maybe 398 would be worth looking at? Like that's sort of the little bit of my frustration. So that's why, is the standard ones are not typically abnormal. If I see abnormal SED rate or CRP in somebody with fibromyalgia, I look for things like lupus or rheumatoid arthritis or other autoimmune diseases that are known to bump those levels up.
Well, you just answered my second follow-up question to that, because for those of us who have elevated CRP and SED rates, we do need more investigation and making sure we get investigated further, or we might be these in-betweeners for autoimmune.
Or there are some people with fibromyalgia, it's not 100%. Like I've definitely had people with fibromyalgia that they do have some elevation in their SED rate and CRP. I just feel like you have to rule out other things. And if you are one of those that do have it, also look for dietary things, because I've seen people that like have sky high CRPs and then they stop eating gluten and it's like, woo. So don't forget about that. Not that you would with all your health coaching experience and nutritional experience, but that's another thing to look at.
Well, it's definitely something, because we got that question a lot, or people are sharing with values, but there's other markers, and there's other differences too on timing of measuring those inflammatory markers, especially SED rate and CRP. And then even when people were asking after they got an infection or they got the flu, seeing those values at different points in time, it's quite fascinating what blood chemistry panels can show.
Indeed.
Can I interject for a second? Because
Yes.
I see people talking about food and y'all are talking about nutrition. And so this always stays right here on the bookshelf behind me. This is Dr. Lipton's book, The Fibro Food Formula. See, I was about to say the Fibro Manual. I love this because I started putting articles on my website about the fibro diet, the good, the bad, and the ugly, because there are absolutely good foods for fibromyalgia. And then there's some that are just like, and then there's some to stay away from. So when you came out with this, I loved it because it's extensive.
Oh, it's the same approach. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's, but I love it because I don't have that background that you do. And so I'm just like, in my experience, these are the different foods, but I absolutely recommend this book to everyone. Red, yellow, and green foods to be able to stay away from. There's some recipes in the back, lots of good information. So while you're on there getting your fibro manual, get this one. Yeah, see, Melissa's got some too.
Look at us, promo PSA moment here. Sorry for the interruption and the commercial break.
You guys are hilarious. I wanted to let you know, if you go to drlipton.com and sign up for my email newsletter, you can get a PDF of the Fibro Food Formula for free.
Yes.
If you prefer like the, paper version, yes, Amazon has it. And thank you for the PSA. Yes, I do also have a product line of CBD and other herbal things to try to reduce fibromyalgia pain. Trying to go at it from all angles. And I had this big fantasy that I could do a study on CBD for fibromyalgia, because CBD in really high doses is beautiful at reducing inflammation, particularly glial cell inflammation. So I was like, okay, let's do a study where we give people LDN and then we give people CBD and then we look at their brain and blah, 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 blah. And then I was like, oh, right, that study will cost $10 million. Okay, well, so I just keep trying to throw out ideas. And then I hope that somebody like Dr. Jared Younger, who has, institutional backing, will do a study. Although, side note, he is right now very busy studying COVID and doing some amazing work on COVID. So just a little shout out to him. He's an amazing researcher.
Yes. I mean, that was something that we talked about too, is how do you feel we can better support as patients research moving forward?
I have no idea. I mean, honestly, the way that research historically has gotten done is through private funding. So Lady Gaga is always my backup plan. So anybody knows her, get her to, fund a fibromyalgia research institute. That's one way, private funding. So one of y'all needs to become really rich, or I do, somebody become rich and fund it. Secondly, government funding. That has all but disappeared due to political changes that were made a few years ago. Won't name names, but things got really cut. Budgets got really cut. So there's not a lot of research funding from the government. Also, they're very distracted by COVID, right? So that's not going to happen. And then the third way is pharmaceutical companies. So pharmaceutical companies are going to do it, anyway. I guess one way would be to volunteer if there are some studies. I think there are a few researchers doing some good work in fibromyalgia. And I think one of my hopes, actually, and one of the ways I think I could help push the needle forward is to kind of maybe connect those that are already doing work, because people are kind of doing it in their own little, silos. So, I had a fantasy of some sort of fibromyalgia research network or something, because there are people doing really good work, but how do we sort of connect them? And then is there a way that there could be some grant funding for that network, or could people do a nonprofit that does some donations and tries to promote that? I'm totally open to ideas, because we need research.
I wonder what nonprofit would help promote that.
I know. I feel like somebody's already starting to work on that. So maybe donating to that nonprofit. I think it's called Support Fibromyalgia.
Well, if you do the math, technically, depending on what the actual statistics are for fibromyalgia, I mean, depending on the range, I mean, right now it's anywhere between 4 to 12 million people. If all 12 million people donate $1, what do we have?
Exactly. I like this. I think it's probably about 10 million. I think that's the number I tend to use, at least in the US.
Okay, well, 10 million, donate
10 million would
$1.
totally do. Yes, absolutely. And the other thing I've been thinking about doing is, I don't know, it wouldn't be 10 million, but my product line, I've been donating to nonprofits. My thought is to sort of really focus towards nonprofits that are doing research or working towards that. So, Support Fibromyalgia is one that I have been supporting and always love to promote. There's not a lot of other groups out there. Like, unfortunately, some of the bigger fibromyalgia, like there used to be some pretty big nonprofits out there as far as doing advocacy, and they've really kind of dropped off the map. So,
well, we would love to support research. I know, Brandy, I would need your help though, because I kind of fangirled out with some of the researchers, because I'm like, anyone with a brain scan machine,
yeah,
and imaging,
yes,
I fangirl out. They have
yeah, and does it work? I mean, are they?
No, but I need to get more professional, so I'm not coming in like a fangirl, like, oh, scan my brain.
Well, maybe we could partner on this, because this was honestly part of what I was thinking when I closed the practice down. So I was like, okay, here's my time to like spend on figuring this out, like getting actual research published, getting stuff done. And it doesn't always have to cost $10 million. The fancy machine scanning stuff, that costs $10 million. But there's a lot of like more basic stuff, like the blood work stuff that they did, the mouse study, that didn't cost $10 million. That there's a lot that can be done for less money. And that's kind of what I'm setting my brain to now after this hiatus I've taken.
Well, that's good, because I have ideas, because I've been running them by Brandy with like brain scan. I guess with the Alzheimer's groups, they've opened up more imaging for Alzheimer's scans, which maybe with the brain, if we're researching the brain, I found a facility that does cash pay to bring some in. So even with Estella, I was like, let's get a van and start with at least 20 patients in Los Angeles. I did the math. We can totally afford it, but I'm missing the MD. So I'm just like,
hey,
okay, but I'll drive the van.
Okay, I have a van and I'll drive down to LA. I totally do. I bought a van.
Okay, so everybody at the community conference has heard it now. We have a fibromyalgia concert in the works and more research.
And I was going to put like stuff, it's a white van, and I was going to put like, fibromyalgia stuff on it. And, I could.
See, everybody's into this. You can scan my brain, my hands up. So we're all willing to donate our bodies and brains for science in that sense.
And I think like this grassroots effort is how it actually will happen, because I don't know if you guys have noticed, but things are kind of going sideways in the world. Everything's all topsy-turvy. And I feel like the way things are getting done truly is with grassroots advocacy. And like, now it's time. I can be a mouse. Yes. Anybody have mice? No, I feel bad. Some people really like mice.
I know that part is hard. That's why I was like, I'll volunteer myself as we'll have tributes. So,
but the mice got better. That's an important piece. Like, I did have one person when I presented this at a conference, they were like, the poor mice. And I was like, oh, I forgot to tell you, like, they didn't like have to, well, they did have to sacrifice some of them because they have to like look at their spinal cord. And I can't, I know.
Well, look, everybody's volunteering for brain scans here. She said, Janet said, I'll be there. I have a Prius. So we have it dialed in, and I know there's a lot of comments and questions. So we're going to do our best to get to it. I know based on time, we want to honor Dr. Lipson time. We could probably do this whole full conference with all kinds of conversations. There's a lot more and addressing these gaps. We definitely are energized. We want to make a difference. There is hope to all of the fibromyalgia patients internationally. I want you to lean into all these community leaders, listen to what's happening. We're all coming together and collaborating. That's the mission here of the Support Fibromyalgia Network. And the first part is bringing the community together. So that's
I wanted to shout out to you, Melissa, that you have done, I'm going to cry here. You have done such an amazing job of pulling the community together. And I don't know if anybody knows how hard it is. And you too, Brandy, it's so hard to do something like this, to pull people together. It takes so much you have been working on this for so long with such dedication, while you're also like training for various things. And I don't know. You are amazing. But I also just wanted to say, like, this is the way, getting us together. And I wonder if maybe I need to organize, maybe next time we do something that's more focused on research, invite some researchers to talk. Most researchers love to talk about their stuff, honestly, like Jared Younger, as long as they don't have to travel, if we do a virtual thing, and then you can kind of figure out, and some people are like, oh, I know about this grant that is available for blah, 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 or you know what I mean? So like maybe a fibromyalgia research conference.
Yes,
I
I'm
just had this
inspired by the
idea.
Open Medicine Foundation, who has
Yes.
tracks for research. I
Yes.
was like, what? I told Brandy one day we got to do that.
Yes, I totally agree. So I've got some spare time in 2023, so I'm on it. And I may just drive my van down to LA and
You might not need to this coming January and February, since I'll be a little bit nomadic and Portland is on the list for permanent residency.
Yay!
So it's
Okay.
between Arizona and Portland. So
Cool.
you may not need to go anywhere. I'll come to you.
Awesome.
Brain delivered directly to you. But I wanted to say also congratulations before we leave. I know this is not your award, but you got a Fibromyalgia Legacy Award.
Thank you.
So thank you
it's
for
my first
all
award.
What?
Yeah, I mean, maybe like I got a soccer trophy in 3rd grade for like best effort or something. But thank you. I really appreciate it. It's very wonderful. So thank you all.
Well, thank you. I definitely mean a lot to the entire fibromyalgia community, and Brandy and I definitely appreciate you so much.
I appreciate you all. And this is such a warm, supportive community. You guys are amazing. And I'm so excited to learn more about Looms for Lupus and join forces with you guys. Like, yay, that's awesome.
Oh yeah, powerhouse team again, and cross collaboration. We had Carrie last night from Taiwan joining us in. So she's a trailblazer advocate over there in Taiwan for multiple chronic illness conditions. So
yeah, we have some rock stars in this
international.
Yes. I think it's truly amazing. And I'm actually like getting chills because I have it can be hard to kind of retain your inspiration, you know what I mean? And hope. And I'm always recharged when I meet with you guys or talk in a setting like this. So thank you for giving me some energy. Like I feel kind of excited and recharged, and watch out 2023.
I know. Well, look at all the wonderful faces that are on the stage, the patient leaders, healthcare providers, researchers. We brought them all together for this conference. So we're all rallying behind our healthcare providers. We know you need it. There's been a lot going on the past couple of years. So we're here for you. Thank you again, Dr. Lipton.
Thank you. Thank you all. Take care.
And we will be right back. So we're going to stop the broadcast and we're going to be bringing on some patient leaders, and Dr. Devoto is going to present for us on the stage, switching gears. So hold on, stay here, and we'll be right back.
Make sure you stretch and move and stay hydrated and get some snacks really quickly.
Yes.